Hello everybody. My name is Keedi Mads. I work here at KVINFO as a program advisor in our international department. I'm very happy to welcome you all here tonight at tonight's event, where you can meet Mads Ananda Lodahl and Anthony Keedi, who will talk about a lot of very interesting issues, I know. Tonight's event is just one out of a lot of events that we are organizing here at KVINFO, or not here necessarily, but that KVINFO is organizing. Tomorrow at the Black Diamond there's a conference and it's called The Future of the Middle East, Revolution or Reform. KVINFO is organizing this in cooperation with the Danish Human Rights Institute and Berlingske Tidende. And then from November 6 till 16, Copenhagen Docs and KVINFO are showing 4 movies about women with a mission. Women from Ukraine, Zambia, Palestine and Egypt. So you should check that out too. And now I'll leave the floor to tonight's moderator, Johanna Wiggen.
Yes. And I'm going to present a little bit more into who we have here. Anthony Keedi is educated as a psychologist and worked for ABART, which is a women-led organization, and you are mostly doing work on gender awareness for men and boys in Lebanon.
Yes, and around the region.
And around the region, and we will hear a bit more about your work. And Mads Ananda Lodahl is probably known to everybody who's interested in gender in Denmark, because you've been this quite outspoken figure against patriarchal society and heteronormativity, and you do that on your blogs and on your homepage at minglet.com, that you should check out as well. And what we will do here is that both guys will talk for around 10 to 15 minutes about their project and their work, and then we will have a conversation that I would moderate, so please feel free to ask any questions and so on, and I will ask some if you don't, and we will see where their talks will take us. Anthony, will you please start?
Sure. Okay. So I wanted to open up with, I was training in a northern part of Lebanon recently, the village of Akkar. And one of the things that we do when we're training men and women on masculinities and gender is to try to make that a little bit more of a personal thing. So we started talking about games that we played when we were younger, to show how that socialization process happens even when we're just playing games. And one of the gentlemen told me that men in the village, young boys in the village at that time, were playing a game called Daesh. And Daesh is the Arabic name for the terrorist group ISIS. And when we asked more about what is this game, what do you do during this game, it's that some people are the regime, and some people are ISIS, and some people are the rebels, and it's just shooting each other and throwing rocks at each other and doing whatever you need to do to beat the other person into submission to win the war. And it's from here that you can start seeing why working with men is so important, and what that means on a very micro-psychological level, but also when you want to zoom out and you want to look at the more structural level of violence that happens around the world. And this is not a Middle Eastern thing. Yeah, in the Middle East it might have a profound effect, and it is an area of extreme conflict, and so you might have more overt examples of this. But I've talked to people from all around the world, and we all played these games when we were kids. And what does that teach someone growing up while they're playing? That dominance and violence is how you win. Dominance and violence is what decides what is right or wrong. So if we want to take that to a very micro level, when we want to talk about gender-based violence, violence against women, or sexual gender-based violence, it's the dominant is the one who's winning. That girl who's walking home alone at 3 o'clock in the morning is wrong because she's weak. She's wrong because she cannot fend herself off. She cannot defend herself. That's her crime. And that's the reason why she has the choice of be raped or don't go out at 3 o'clock at night. And on a much more structural level, we're teaching them something that history teaches us over and over. That's the thing about gender. It's years and years and years of the same rules, illogical or wrong as they are, that have been reinforced. That it's the strong that write the histories. It's the winner, it's the victor who writes the histories of what actually happened or is happening at the moment. And that's what young men learn. And when we want to zoom out and we want to talk about issues such as women's political participation, or seeing women as leaders, or making room for those women, men are not being socialized like that. Men are still being socialized in a very militant manner, where you win by shooting, you win by killing, you win by being dominant. And this is a lot of the work that we do in general when it comes to masculinities, on a very individual level and on a more macro level. So although I won't be able to get into the details of that work and how many different ways of working on it because it's 10 minutes, on a micro level, violence has one of two reactions. It's reacted with violence or fear. And none of those strengthens a dynamic. None of those strengthens a relationship. And none of those are psychologically healthy or contribute to a person's psychological well-being. So when we want to talk about working with men and how men and working on masculinities and changing that traditional, rigid, violent, masculine gender role is good for women, but it's also good for men because men are not benefiting from this gender role. Men are not benefiting from being violent. We're the ones dying in wars. Cardiac arrest, not living as long, not having meaningful, influential relationships with the other person, not being able to emotionally express. Men don't cry, men don't hurt, men don't feel pain, men are not afraid. So we're asking men to be anything but human. The same way we ask women to be everything but human when we tell her, don't have aspirations, don't have a job, you're not supposed to be outspoken, you're supposed to be quiet. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to show that simply because this is the way that you've always been does not mean, or this is the way that your father and your mother were, or your grandparents, does not mean that it's right. And development and gender equality go hand in hand. We cannot expect society to become developed without deviating from violence, without having women taking more of a central role as leaders in our societies. We're missing out on a lot of great ideas. We're missing on fathers who are wonderful caretakers. So much research goes out showing that violence in adulthood is highly correlated with being either a victim of violence or witnessing violence in your childhood. So many men don't, and women don't have present father figures when they're young. And a lot of our work, especially when you want to bring it back, I'm deviating a little bit, to gender-based violence or sexual gender-based violence, is because we have not yet started to think about relations between men and women in a different way. So men are still seen as the dominant. And it's when men stop seeing themselves as a dominant or having that male privilege of being able to do with a woman what they want because they are the men or they are the powerful ones, that's when we're going to start noticing some changes. That's when we're going to start having women take on more of a role and know what we need to do to stop these issues. And like I said, there's a lot of different ways that gets done, but maybe we can touch on those later. I don't want to take up all the time.
Maybe you could just expand a little bit on how you see the situation in Lebanon now. What kind of male women roles are there? What's going on?
It's still very traditional in terms of out of 128 seats of our parliament, women occupy 4. So when we want to talk about looking at an objective measure of how we look at women as leaders, they're not really there. Women role models are typically singers, actresses, highly sexualized, and that doesn't really lead to much influential change in the future. Although there are some standouts and there are your outliers, women are still not seen other than the mother, the caretaker, someone who sacrifices, or the entertainer, or the sexual object. And men are still seen as a provider, as the tough one, the strong one. He's expected to lead and everyone to follow. He's expected to have all the answers, not be emotional. These type of things, and we're working on changing it. However, conflict is a natural antagonist to development, and the more we see violence, the more we have people regress to what's known, what they know already, because that's what you do when you get afraid. When you get afraid, you just go back to what you know. You're not going to experiment with that you don't know. And when we talk about equal gender relations and partnership, that's still relatively new all around the world. What does that look like? How do you talk with each other? How do you interact? What if we don't fit the molds that we've been told to fit, then what mold do we fit? And when you have the space to do that, because no one's shooting at you or dropping bombs on you, it's still difficult. But when you're in fear of your life, you don't even question. You don't even think about it. You just do as you're told, because you're led to believe that that's what's going to allow you to survive. And I think that's the issue we deal with a lot around the Middle East, but specifically in Lebanon.
And when it comes to our tonight's theme, gender-based violence, how is the situation looking in Lebanon?
We still don't have a law that protects women from family violence in our own house. So if I hear someone in the apartment next to me and a husband is beating his wife, I cannot do anything. Unless I want to take the law into my own hands and go over and be patriarchal and violent and settle it in a very protector manner versus in a way that we would expect of a developed gender equal society.
You can't call the police?
I can call them because I have a telephone. What they'll do about it doesn't really, they won't really respond in a manner that I would hope that they would. A lot of times they say that that's a domestic issue and that we should leave them be. One strategy that we've employed recently is telling the people to call several times and having many members of the community call. So the police will respond simply because they're tired of getting phone calls about the same family, and so they will go over there and they will do something. Other than that, we also have anyone who knows anything about the Middle East knows the word wasta, and that means the general meaning is your social influence. And so a lot of the police worry that if they were to get involved and that person knows somebody, that person would call and they would get punished for intervening or doing something. So a lot of the police are afraid to act even if they would like to, because they're worried that something would reflect negatively upon them. We still have a lot of ways to go in terms of institutionalizing what it means to be gender equal, or protecting women from sexual gender-based violence or
How about sexual harassment? Because that's a huge issue in other parts of the Middle East.
Yeah, especially we hear a lot about it in Egypt and in Cairo specifically.
Yeah.
No. Again, it's difficult to really hone in on that because sexual harassment happens all the time in Lebanon, especially verbal. However, you also have traditional mechanisms to keep that from happening, which is not a solution. So going out with a male chaperone, or making sure your brother is with you, or your boyfriend, or your father, will actually reduce sexual harassment, and that becomes people's solution. Or not going out at a certain time of night. Well, that will reduce sexual harassment, but it's by putting women in the box. It's by telling them that you're not allowed to act like an adult who wants to go out or should be free to walk the streets at any time of the day or night without having your rights infringed upon. But as long as you have a male protector, then you'll be okay. And that dependence on the male, that's patriarchy. And so that is less of an issue, but only because of these other patriarchal mechanisms that take place.
Great. I think we'll hear much more about your work in Lebanon, but I think I'll pass the word on to you, Mads.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to, I think when we're talking about gender-related violence, I think one of the most dangerous mistakes we can do is to isolate the actual violence and look at the violence as something isolated. I think it's necessary to see the violent act, the fist in the face, as something that is linked to a whole lot of different things. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. Also, the way I see it, you can't really separate women's struggles from trans struggles or gay struggles, for example. All these things are connected. I don't see violence against women and anti-queer violence as something extreme. I don't think it's not an act of extremism. it is an extreme expression of the very normal notion that women and queer people should not and cannot expect the same amount of safety and freedom as straight men. Okay? Violence against women and queer people is the extreme expression of the common notion that women and queer people cannot expect or should not expect the same amount of freedom and safety as straight men. I made a drawing today. So, to put the violence into a context, how is violence possible? I think that violence and genocide, as it says here at the top of the pyramid, is possible through a process of dehumanization. Okay, so that there is a fundament that is necessary for violence to happen, and that fundament starts with people not giving a fuck, not caring, flicking through the news feed of the newspaper and not even looking into that news that says that 1 out of 2 women in Denmark is going to experience sexual harassment in her lifetime. That carelessness, that insensitivity, that's where the violence starts. Then you have jokes, stereotypes, pornography, hip-hop music videos, for example. Then you have actual discrimination in the workplaces, housing, health, etc. And then you have violence, rape, murder, threats, vandalism, etc. And then at the end you have genocide. So this puts the actual violent act into a context. Is it possible to read it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So I think this is something that is necessary, and you also talked about it, Anthony, in terms of like masculinity roles, etc. And how you look at women. Like if it's, why is it possible? Why is it okay to attack a woman when she's going home alone at night? It's because we have stereotypes and ideas about what's a woman's role in society. Now then we also need to look at, this is the violence, this puts the violence into context. Then we need to look at the people who are experiencing these things. And this I call the power pyramid and evil expectations. We know the power pyramid that we know from a lot of from capitalism, from feudalism, and where you have people on top who have the most power, and then the further down in the pyramid you go, the less power people have. And so in patriarchy, or as in the straight world order, as I call it, the people at the top are people who are male, masculine, heterosexuals, and who are not transgender people. They're at the top, and so they oppress, you could say, everybody else. And this is the sense that we talked about the government in Lebanon, for example, but also in other terms, men hold the majority of the economical power, the political power, and the social and the cultural power. So in that sense, men oppress everybody who is not men. That's easy to understand, that's simple. What's complicated is that expectations come in from all sides and attack everybody in the pyramid, no matter where you are in the pyramid. This is also what you talked about, Anthony, that we expect women and queer people, for example, to be weak and defenseless, unarmed. We expect them to not be able to organize, to be hysterical, emotional, irrational. And then we expect men to be always able to solve any problems and always have solutions, to always be strong and courageous, even when people are dropping bombs on them. Okay, so these expectations oppress everybody, because what they do is they limit everybody. They make it impossible for anybody to be a full human being. So you can see that everybody is in trouble in this society, in patriarchy. Everybody is in trouble, but some are more in trouble than others, because everybody's in trouble with the expectations, but a lot of us are also in trouble with the people on top of the pyramid. So how does this relate to today's subject of men's gender-related violence? Well, I think it relates in the way that normally when we talk about, a lot of times when we talk about it, we simplify it by looking at this block up here, the actual violence, and then looking at the victims of the violence. Okay, so we make centers for battered women, for example, or we write an article about the trans woman who got attacked. So we're looking at the actual act of violence and we're looking at the victim. I think that's a mistake and it's not going to get us anywhere. We need to look at the full picture first of all, and if we do need to focus, we need to shift the focus. We need to look at the top of the pyramid, because the people who do violence are men. Men are the people doing violence to other people, almost exclusively. Okay, so this is where we need to focus, and then I think we need to focus at the bottom over here. We need to focus on the fundament. What is it that actually makes violence possible? So I hope this is something that we can talk about more today.
Yeah. Okay. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, with everything you said, actually.
Yeah. Oh.
I can go sit over there if you
Yeah.
Please don't.
Well, now we stated that this is the reasons. I think maybe it's time to kind of like discuss what to do about it. But before we do that, I kind of like to hear a little bit about you too, because it's not that common to kind of like realize that the world might look like that. And I'm wondering, how did you get interested in gender? Because like you're one of those who enjoy all the privilege. Why did you find it interesting?
I found it. I didn't find it interesting. I suffered from it, and I made other people that I loved suffer from it.
Yeah. How was that? Why?
All right. Well, I was always raised very, very masculine. I grew up in the United States because Lebanon had a civil war, and my parents fled from war. So, and that's to show that this, when I say it's not a Middle Eastern thing, yes, extreme environments of conflict, we'll notice this a lot more. It'll be a lot more overt, but it exists everywhere. And my parents had to work quite a bit when I was young, so I didn't have too much to do, and so I started hanging around with street gangs. And I learned how to be very violent. And with other men, that was physically. With women, because I was raised that you never are physically violent, I drew the line there. But I didn't even know the level to which I could be psychologically or verbally violent with many of the women that I loved. And that becomes normal. Just because you hear that you're not allowed to cry, you shouldn't express yourself. If someone steps on your feet, you step on their neck. You have to be dominant, you have to be this, you have to be that. And that doesn't ever give you peace. That doesn't bring you any closer to anyone. And so one day, I was walking down the aisle of a bookstore in Chicago, and I saw books that said, I don't want to talk about it. And that's what I would always say. When I was feeling something, and when I was hurt, or when I just didn't, like, inside I would hope that I could talk to someone about it and wish that I could talk to someone about it. But the second the moment would actually arise, patriarchy would step in, my socialization would step in, and I would tell the person that I'm just tired, or to fuck off, and I don't want to talk about it. And I would deal with that in very negative ways. I would act out. The hurt that I felt would be expressed in aggression or anger or risk-taking behavior or all of the other things that we see in a textbook of masculinities was me.
Yeah.
Until a few, 8 years ago, something like that, one of my ex-girlfriends now very bravely told me that I could be psychologically violent, and that hurt. And it forced me to, I was undergoing my own psychotherapy at the time, to be a psychologist.
Yeah.
And I started investigating that role a little bit more and what that meant, and I found out how many ways, not only her, with my brother, with my friends, with my father, with all of the different ways that my acting out was hurting other people, which is exactly the opposite. I was acting aggressively when I felt hurt because I wanted that closeness. Because I wanted love so badly, when something would happen, I wouldn't know how to communicate that properly, and I would act out. And acting out always kept people from being close to me. And so I just worked on that myself, and then started investigating a little bit more about how this does affect one's psychology, this inability to emotionally express, to communicate properly with others, socializing them towards violence and aggression, and what that means for one's psychological well-being. And I met an NGO that was working on that specifically with men in relation to gender equality. And
yeah. And
can I just ask, do you feel better now? do you feel more happy?
I do feel more at peace. The difficult thing is, again, when you're asking anyone who steps outside the box, as I don't need to explain to you, absolutely, but I don't even think I need to explain this so much to everyone in the room. Simply by being here, I think you're these type of people. But it's never easy being outside the box.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing I tell people is that socialization never goes away. You're never healed. That violent masculine thing, it's still the first thought that goes through my mind. I'll give the example to anyone who's been in Lebanon. We don't have traffic laws. Ants are more organized in the way they crawl around on the street than the way people drive in Lebanon. And the second someone pulls out in front of me, the first thought in my head, especially when they lower the window and they swear at me or they flick me out, the first thought in my head is always, if I got out of this car right now, I would. And then you have to stop yourself and realize that that never goes away, and that's that socialization, and calm yourself down. And people criticize you. They criticize you about being emotional or being vulnerable or crying or, again, even in interpersonal relationships, people don't get it because they still have societal expectations as they are, and you're acting in a different manner. So am I happier? I'm more at peace with myself, but happier is also your coexistence with others. And I think when we all start changing a little bit more, then everyone will be happy. But it's going to be difficult to stay outside the box.
Do you wish you'd never got engaged with feminism?
No. No, that was definitely a plus. That was definitely a plus.
I can't help thinking, like, is it just like being gay, being queer, then suddenly you don't have all these notions of masculinity, or do you recognize some of these patterns from your own life?
I recognize some of it, yeah, definitely. I think it's a really difficult question, because I feel like I was also raised to be a real man, but I kind of always just didn't feel like that. I always felt like I failed at it, and I was shouting homophobic and sexist abuse at people long before I found out that I wasn't straight myself. So I don't know, it's I felt like that was always something I was supposed to become but never really had access to.
No. And you don't feel like you've always been kind of like good at expressing your emotion, calming your own violent sides and so on?
I think I've always been pretty good at expressing like emotional stuff, actually, and I think the violence side is something that I've had to nourish more. This is something that I've actively wanted to nourish. Not
you
the violence side, but
how's that?
Aggression, because as a queer person and as a sensitive person and as a freak, I've always been a freak. Also before I was, also when I was a child, I've always been in conflict with the surrounding world, and I think as a sensitive person, I've always more kind of just like
Introverted.
What?
Introverted.
Yeah, but I've always more just humbled myself and just kind of like took whatever shit people gave me. So I think for me it was more about learning to stand up against it and to say no, which is something that I know that is a big part of the feminist struggle. Also, often with women, it is that a lot of times women actually have to learn to be more aggressive and more assertive, you could say. Assertive is maybe a better word. So
there's a kind of like where you have to kind of like get less aggressive. You actually have to learn to stand up for yourself.
Yeah, it's a dilemma, because, for example, when I'm on public transport, for example, and if I butch up and become like more kind of aggressive, or
it's assertive though. It's not aggressive.
Yeah. But if I do that, it will be misinterpreted by the people on the bus as I'm just some other macho guy. So that's one of the reasons why, for example, I wear nail polish, is to not be misinterpreted.
That's really interesting.
Actually, I also overcompensate. We were talking about this earlier. I've had conversations with people in this room earlier today. That's why I keep on looking. But I want to say two things.
Yeah.
Number one, that's kind of what we're asking for, though. The women's empowerment movement is simply taking on parts that were traditionally masculine. So being ambitious, being a leader, being resilient, being strong, all of these are good qualities that are traditionally given to men that now we want to give to women and foster. That's why I'll never phrase it like this, because men don't like it being phrased like this, and you have to talk about gender without using the word. But this is why this is almost a men sensitivity movement, where you want to give men things that are typically socialized for women. Being caring, being sensitive, being vulnerable, being that open. It's typically not something that we're taught. And maybe one of the critical differences between you and I when we were younger was just I was very good at violence. That's the only thing that didn't get me picked on every single day, especially looking so different and being an Arab in the US. And the fact that I could throw a punch really well kept me on top of that pyramid. That was the power. And that's why everything you were saying resonated very much, and that's why we both have different things to work on. For me, it's constantly working on that sensitivity and teaching other men to work on that, since that's typically a heterosexual man's experience. Whereas people who are, well, even heterosexual men who are not overly dominant need to work on being more assertive. And that's the point. We want human beings to have all of these qualities, or to be able to express these qualities. To be assertive when someone is bearing down on your rights. There's nothing wrong about raising your voice. And the fact that you do that is amazing. And that's what we teach the majority of women every single day. But Anthony didn't need to raise his voice anymore. His voice was already really loud. He needed to quiet down a little bit. He needed to listen. And so for that, other people have a different message. And the overcompensation, I find that so funny, because I spend so much of my time talking about being vulnerable and being sensitive and all this other stuff that, I work out all the time. So, I'm typically the look of masculinity, and then I walk in and tell you it's okay to cry. And I do that because I think on some level we also want to find that balance, That's pretty funny that you said you wear nail polish, because when you do speak out, you don't want to be perceived as overly aggressive.
But don't you think it's actually easier to kind of toughen up than quieting down? What do you find most difficult or easy?
Definitely, it's easier to butch up in this society, because what you're doing, Anthony, makes you more vulnerable. What I'm doing is making me more, less vulnerable, basically. So of course, but but it's kind of like a lot of times women also get into these different dilemmas. I know that if you have all the sex you want, you're a slut, and if you don't have the sex you want, then you're what's
frigid.
Yeah. Or if you shave your legs, you're a victim of the beauty ideals, and if you don't, you're nasty. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with me. It's if I don't butch up, I'm an easy victim. Mm-hmm. If I do, I kind of just insert reproduce patriarchy. It's the same. I'm all for more women representation in the media, and I'm constantly talking with journalists about feminism, but if I didn't, it would just be the bad guys talking. Maybe. So it's always I feel like maybe things are more simple if you're just a straight man. The battle is more simple.
No, you're definitely in a position of power. Always being in a position of power is easier.
Yeah.
But in some ways it must be very difficult to let go of your power. That must be one of the most difficult things.
If you frame it like that. But you don't, when you tell someone how much they gain by letting go, that's the important part. It's not a logical thing, it's an emotional thing, and it takes training. It's not easy to be vulnerable. No one likes being vulnerable, and we all have our defense mechanisms and we shut down. It's just, with men, with the majority of men, we've socialized them for so long to not be vulnerable. And that They can do anything but cry. Drugs, drinking, fighting, driving in your car fast to the point where
You kill
that is more
yourself.
acceptable than crime.
Mhm.
And it's just unlearning that's the difficult part. But I don't think there's one that's more difficult than the other. I just think it's going against your natural grain to try to be an ideal that you'd like to see in society.
I think.
Just because I can see that someone has a question down there.
Er det okay, at sige det på dansk?
Ja, så kan jeg oversætte, ja.
Det er mest til Mads, når han siger, at det er nemmere at butche op. Så tænker jeg, at der er vel også en grad af, at man... Der er vel også en grad af, at man så på den måde synliggør en eller anden situation, og på den måde muligvis er mere sårbar. Jeg ved ikke, har du en kommentar til det?
I'm just translating. He's saying that when Mads is pointing out that it's easier to butch up, you also make yourself more vulnerable because you're kind of like making a situation much more visible to other people.
And I mean, I think that's what I took from what you said, because before you would be humble and you'd lower your eyes and you'd allow that silence allows the patriarchy and the violence and the system to continue. And yeah, you do make yourself more. I completely agree, because when you speak up, you're not being silent about it. I completely agree.
Yeah.
What do you think, Mads?
Yeah, I think it's constantly. I mean, what I said before, like if you're like at the top of the pyramid, it's pretty simple. It's simple. It's not easy. It's simple. It's either you stay there and you reproduce it, or there's like a very straight path set out for you that's feminism. That's very easy what to do to be progressive. But as a queer person who's perceived as male, it's really complicated. And like if I butch up and am confrontative, a lot of different things are happening at the same time. I make myself more visible and thus more vulnerable, but I also reproduce masculinity, and I also confront oppression. So there's a lot of different things happening at the same time.
I don't think you're reproducing masculinity. Because again, I think you're being assertive. I don't think you're being aggressive.
What if I get into fist fights?
So that's aggressive.
Can I give you an example? Can I give an example?
Yeah,
A few months ago, I was at the central station, and this goes along with this whole thing that I was talking about. I was at the central station, holding hands with another guy, and there are hundreds of people literally around us. And from the other end, like of the room, there's this guy who starts shouting at us. It's in the middle of the day, and he's like, fucking faggots, blah, 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 I'm gonna beat you up. It was in the middle of the day, there were hundreds of people. And so this is the extreme act of violence and threats. But nobody reacted, and this is what makes this possible. Imagine a society where you didn't have what I said before, where you didn't have the expectations that women and queer people should not expect the same amount of safety. If you didn't have that society, if you didn't have all of this, everybody in the whole room would turn around and be like, what the fuck? And then I got up. We were 2 against 1, and we can both fight. So I was like, yeah, okay. Like, if you can't behave in public space, you should go home and play your PlayStation, or come over here and get in a fight with us. Your choice. And he was trying to go through all the people, and was like, rah, and shouting, and everybody was just like, oh, something is happening. And people just completely ignored it. And then it was too difficult for him to get across the room to us, so he left. Good for everybody. But I mean, I think that's kind of reproducing the masculinity that you were talking about. That being a man means that you are always ready to stand up for yourself and defend yourself.
On the other hand, you're really challenging his stereotypes about what gays would be.
Exactly. So it's a double.
I think that's difficult for everybody. I mean, because again, when is assertiveness and speaking out, breaking on, being violent or being aggressive? And the other night I was out with a colleague, and we were walking on the street, and these guys were just looking at this. Like, literally, it probably would have been more polite if they were saying what they were thinking than just looking at her and thinking it. And I couldn't shut up about it. But I didn't shut up about it in a good way. I called them trash. I was like, look at you, you're trash. How are you looking at her? Like,
And then suddenly you were like
Get
the
the fuck out.
protective
Get the-
big brother in some ways. Yeah.
Exactly. And the person who was with me was like, no, I like the fact that you're not quiet about it, but couldn't you have said, that's a very rude, turn your eyes? And I was like, I could have, it just doesn't sound like me in my head. Like, that's not the first thing. And like, so I think it's always a struggle, like finding out, and we're not perfect. We're
You don't
first
have to
gen.
be.
No, we're first gen. I mean, not for, well, in the Middle East, but I mean, I think that the real inspiration, I think, will become the people who come after us. Because they'll have a better idea of, definitely not me, but they'll have a better idea of how to speak up without being overly aggressive, or how not to be quiet while being assertive. But I think we're still undoing what happened to us, so.
Yeah, I also talked to a woman at one of my lectures, and she was like, she asked, okay, so if people are kind of being like sexually harassing me at a cafe or something, that this was something that happened to her, what should I do? And I was like, pour your coffee in their lap. And she was like, but then I'm no better than them. And then I said, do you have to be? You know, I think it's also like, you know, it's also just like there's a conflict and there's a war and between people, and this is not something that we started. You know, we don't have to always be perfect. It's better to speak
No,
up.
but I think we have to strive to be. We won't.
Yeah, as good as possible.
There's a question.
I feel like, yeah, can we have some, I feel like this is a group therapy over here. And this is just a whole bunch of voyeurs like watching us talk about. Please, questions.
Hi. I just want to hear, I guess this is a question to Mads, but hopefully you also have some reflections on it, Anthony. But yeah, actually I have two questions. So the first one is, in regards to this, how do we try and fight this fight without using the war rhetoric, without like reproducing the whole violent methods? How do you write? I really enjoy everything you write, Mads, but sometimes I also see you have some like war rhetoric, and I can see why you have this kind of rhetoric. But what are your reflections on how you communicate your messages without it becoming too violent a language? So that's one question. Is it clear? Yeah. And then my other question is regarding, you said that we have to like switch focus towards the men. Could you say, maybe both of you say a bit about how to do this, which methods to use to get these men talking or feeling or whatever?
Yeah, I'm also very, I think we will start with the first, and then I think we should go a little bit more into depth about like what are you actually doing? What are your strategies for change in some ways? Because it will be interesting to see, to compare.
Yeah. First of all, my favorite book is The Art of War by Sun Tzu. And secondly, most of what I read
What kind of book is that?
That's a military strategy book that's 2,000 years old.
Yeah,
For
okay.
the Chinese army at that time.
Yeah. Why do you love it so much?
Totally recommend it because I think it's obligatory reading for the U.S. Marines also. You can read it and then you can translate it into every kind of conflict in your life. Have you read it also?
Yeah, also it's very Machiavellian. It's like the Prince or like the 48 Laws of Power.
Except Sun Tzu is working with armies, and
It's mandatory reading when you're a man. You're born in the crib and they give it to you.
I read it only as a faggot though, but but Machiavelli is more like a manual.
I mean, I'm a woman, so I haven't
so.
read this. Like, can we have some of the advices? What is it that you learn from reading this book?
Yeah, for example, Sun Tzu talks about the ultimate form being formlessness. Okay, so if you have an army that doesn't have a formation that is recognizable in any way for the enemy, it's impossible for the enemy to attack it. I think that's what queer is. Okay, because queer is something that the word queer has so many different meanings, depending on if you're asking the the trash drag performers or the academics or the activists, they all have different definitions of it. So nobody can attack queer because it has formlessness. Okay, that's what I think. That's one of my. And then he said he has this beautiful phrase. He says, in order to have the fullness, you need your attack to be like eggs thrown on stones. Okay, so you need to be really full. Okay, this is getting a bit too out of hand.